bird nerds, plant nerds, those of you who are losing sleep over the state of the climate. COP29, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, that is, COP is Conference of Parties. All the people who are interested and invested in a climate change outcome, a positive one. Well, it's finished and they have released an agreement. But how much of an agreement have in fact they reached, and what will it actually achieve? So what I've been doing for a couple of days is going through what I can, news reports, but I've found one video, one discussion that seems to encompass all of the problems that are tied up in these global meetings and agreements. And I'm going to play it, probably stop every now and then with contributions. But this is from Novara Media, and this I recommend absolutely. Subscribe to Novara Media on YouTube, and you'll also find them on Blue Sky. But there is already a fake Novara Media on Blue Sky. So follow the link from YouTube to Novara Media to find them on Blue Sky and the other socials, but that's where they're fairly active. Let's bring them up, and I think where will we be? I think we'll be in that one. I'll pop myself down in the corner. Now, there's about 20 minutes of discussion, but this is, to my mind, the best conversation that I have heard, pointing out what the pros of the COP29 agreement is, and then some of the limitations, and indeed how the agreement was come to. And you won't find any of this on the United Nations page. So let's just roll with it.
Thank you so much. This weekend, a last-minute deal was reached at COP29 to provide $300 billion a year in climate finance to developing countries. But the deal wasn't met with universal praise. Poorer nations at the summit say they viewed the deal as too little, too late. And the response from India's representative was particularly stinging.
This document is nothing more than an optical illusion. This, in our opinion, will not address the enormity of the challenge we all face. Therefore, we oppose the adoption of this document. We oppose the adoption of this document. India opposes the adoption of this document, and please take note and regard of what we have just said from the floor of this room.
So the Indian representative there, completely furious at the deal that had just been passed. The wealthier countries, though, including our own, have welcomed the deal. This was Ed Miliband.
I'm very pleased that we've got this deal through. It's the right thing for Britain. It's the right thing for speeding up the clean energy transition, which is good for Britain, and it will help protect us against climate change. And that's the right thing to do. And it will also help generate jobs and growth for people in Britain. It's an 11th hour deal at the 11th hour for climate and for keeping 1.5 degrees alive. It's the right thing to do for Britain and the right thing for the world.
So who should we take more seriously, the poorer nations and that representative from India, or Ed Miliband? Earlier today, I spoke to Asad Rehman, director of War on Want, who was at the climate summit in Baku. I asked him what he made of the deal.
Insufficient, inadequate, and an insult. Many developing countries called it a joke, but it's a deadly joke for both planet and people.
And I mean, why is this a deal that's caused so much disquiet? As far as I understand, before this was signed, there was an agreement for $100 billion a year for sort of climate finance. This has tripled that to $300 billion a year. I mean, on the face of it, that would seem like progress, but obviously you disagree. Lots of people there disagree. Can you explain why?
Yeah. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves, we started this climate summit with a dire warning from the UN. We are 1.5 degrees is on life support. We are likely to bust through 2 degrees within the coming decades. And by the end of the century, so within a lifetime of somebody born now, we will hit 3 degrees, which will be absolutely catastrophic, both for people and the planet. Society as we know it will be fundamentally altered. So we know that finance is really critical, because finance is what is needed by developing countries to help them cut their emissions, to be able to adapt to the realities of all this climate violence that's already happening, and to pay for the incredible costs that they're already facing from these killer floods, droughts, famines, and of course to be able to have the resources to be able to transition their economies away from fossil fuels and not develop in the same way that rich countries did. And fundamentally, this is a debt. It's a climate debt. Rich countries have consumed about, if we see the atmosphere as a cake, 4/5 of that slices has been consumed by rich countries, way more than their share. And there's only 1/5 left if we want to prevent temperatures to keep below 1.5. So developing countries need support as a legal obligation. And it's written into the Climate Convention. It's written into the Paris Agreement. Now, the UN itself estimated that you'd need between about 5 to 7 trillion for developing countries to meet all the costs. They came into these negotiations with way less than that. They were saying, look, 1.3 trillion, of which 600 billion should at least be in grant-based, because they know from the 100 billion that was provided in 2009, which of course had no bearing on need or on the science, was just a number plucked out of thin air. Only 30 plus billion of that was actually new money. The rest of it was recycled aid, debt creating loans, etc. So this 300 billion, whilst it sounds like a lot, actually when you unpack it, it's not at all. First, there's no assurance about how much of it is going to be in grants and how much is it in debt creating loans. This is like an arsonist burning down somebody's house, shrugging their shoulders and saying, take out a loan to pay for the damage I've just caused. It's just not right. Secondly, it's 300 billion by 2035, not on each year. Nobody knows. Is it 100 billion each year and then only 300 billion in 2035? And thirdly, if you take in the current rate of inflation, in 2035, that 300 billion is going to be worth not much more than the 100 billion that was given in 2009. And when you...
Now that's a crucial point, really, that it's really less money than was already committed. And so much of the 300 billion is money that has already been committed in other programs. They've just tied it all up into this big number that sounds good. But it hasn't been arrived at by using the science and using any measures that are actually necessary. So it's not outcome based. It is just, in my mind, a method for the rich countries who continue to increase their petroleum output. Australia, very obviously, one of those. The US particularly, but loads of others. And they're able to walk away, like Ed Miliband, who was the opposition leader in the UK prior to Jeremy Corbyn. So what are we talking? 7, 8 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. And India, there's an interesting point about when that statement was made, but India do not think that this deal is anywhere near sufficient, and I think they're probably right. But let's Let's count. Oh, what happened there? Oh, here we go. Where's he gone? Where's he gone? There he is. Sorry. Where is that coming from? There. Jesus. Sorry, folks. I've got too many things open on my computer and they're all popping up at the wrong time.
In Africa alone, the countries and within the continent.
A couple of minutes. There we are. We'll just come back to here.
300 billion. Well, it sounds like a lot. Actually, when you unpack it, it's
I'll get that whole about the three.
As a cake, you know, 4/5 of that slices has been consumed by rich countries, way more than their share. And there's only 1/5 left if we want to prevent temperatures to keep below 1.5. So developing countries need support as a legal obligation. And it's written into the Climate Convention. It's written into the Paris Agreement. Now, the UN itself estimated that you'd need between about 5 to 7 trillion for developing countries to meet all the costs. They came into these negotiations with way less than that. They were saying, look, 1.3 trillion, of which 600 billion should at least be in grant-based, because they know from the 100 billion that was provided in 2009, which of course had no bearing on need or on the science, was just a number plucked out of thin air. Only 30 plus billion of that was actually new money. The rest of it was recycled aid, debt creating loans, etc. So this 300 billion, whilst it sounds like a lot, actually when you unpack it, it's not at all. First, there's no assurance about how much of it is going to be in grants and how much is it in debt created loans. This is like an arsonist burning down somebody's house, shrugging their shoulders and saying, take out a loan to pay for the damage I've just caused. It's just not right. Secondly, it's 300 billion by 2035, not on each year. Nobody knows. Is it 100 billion each year and then only 300 billion in 2035? And thirdly, if you're taking the current rate of inflation, in 2035, that 300 billion is going to be worth not much more than the 100 billion that was given in 2009. And when you think that in Africa alone, the countries and within the continent of Africa are paying unsustainable debt repayments of over 170 billion, you can see why so many developing countries and civil society were so angry and saying, we would rather have no deal rather than a bad deal, because this will lock us in for the next decade or so on the promises or little promises that developed countries are making.
And could you actually take us a couple of steps back in terms of how these climate financing sort of mechanisms work? Is there a central fund? And then if you're a developing country, you can say, we want to build a wind farm. Can we have some support? Or we need to build some, flood defenses. Can we have some support? How does this work?
It's a bit complicated because there are a series of funds. So there's not one fund. There's a Green Climate Fund, there's an Adaptation Fund, and there's a Loss and Damage Fund. And there are various other mechanisms. Most of them are empty. And so developing countries, come with projects and they say, this is our need. We've done this need assessment, and they apply to these funds. And these funds are meant to then say, yes, here's the money to be able to do that. But if these COP funds are empty, where do developing countries go to? So what developing countries are told is, well, go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and get some more debt creating loans, like Pakistan was told to do after it faced one flood, which caused $45 billion worth of damage. They had to beg for more debt creating loans. The other thing that developed countries say is, well, why don't you look to the carbon markets? Now, the carbon markets has been set up by developed countries, which many of us call is basically a permit to pollute, which says developed countries, rather than cutting their own emissions, would be able to buy a permit by supporting some emission reduction somewhere else in the world. I mean, firstly, there's not enough carbon budget to do that. Secondly, most of these carbon permits, are not worth the paper they're written on. They result in no emission reduction. And thirdly, most of the money actually goes back to global north, banks and private corporations, very little to frontline communities, which is why developing countries have always insisted what they want is this money to go into these funds, which are governed under the United Nations. Therefore, they could be transparent, there could be more effective governance over them, and they have a far better chance of actually directing the money to where it's needed.
Let's talk about the COP process, because one thing I have to say, reading about this today, that somewhat confused me, is my understanding was for an agreement to be made at a COP, it has to be unanimous by consensus. But then we've also seen the Indian representative sort of come out and say, let it be known, we don't support this. So how can it be that this agreement has passed with, well, at least one country here saying they don't support it? How does that work?
Not only did India oppose it, Cuba, Bolivia, the least developed countries, many countries were indignant about the way that this process took place. So this process, like every other process, is governed really by geopolitics. Rich developed countries wanted that outcome. They got the presidency to announce it and gavel it through without any opportunity for any country to raise any objection. So once it's gavelled through, you can raise your objection and it's just noted, but the decision's been made. And that's why many people felt that this decision was bulldozed through against the wishes of developing countries.
So I'll just reinforce what they're saying there. The president of the COP gathering was from Azerbaijan. That's right, isn't it? Baku, a petro-state. And the agreements are supposed to be unanimous, every country agreeing. But the rules of the meeting are that if the president of the assembly there thinks that they've got agreement and he bangs the gavel and says passed or agreed to, bang, that's it. And there were at least 4 or 5 countries that did not agree. So the rest of the world telling their own constituents that this was a unanimous agreement and a wonderful outcome seems like total bullshit. Now I'm going to come back a few minutes again. Here we go. This is about how the let's just get Michael back a few more frames. We'll cover that bit again, and then we'll go through the story, a bit more of the story, and then we'll have a little discussion after this conversation about whether we think that this is really positive change or not. It's interesting to note that so much of the funding is actually linked back to bodies like the IMF and possibly the World Bank, which is actually loading debt onto these countries. And that is eventually the debt leads to profit in the countries that are already doing the polluting. And those countries are saying to countries that are not anywhere near developed, saying, why don't you look to the carbon market? And the carbon market is only designed so that those of us in developed countries do not have to reduce the amount of emissions that we all put out. And this is one of the things I grapple with all the time. I stopped driving. I got rid of my car in 2014 because I didn't want to be that person always talking about we need to do something about climate change. And then everyone saying, yeah, but you're driving around. And I thought, yeah, well, I don't need to. Very rarely do I need a car. And if I do, there are options to utilize that kind of transport without needing to own one and then use all of those resources all the time on trips you do not need to take in a car. Admittedly, not everyone can do that, but I think we are wedded to the idea that we don't need to give up anything to protect the planet, and I think that's absolute rubbish. You know, you can at me and you can have your say in the comments, but I don't think we can all. I mean, Australia individually, we have the highest emission as individuals in the world of carbon emissions. We are the greediest users of energy in the world, individually. And all of us could do something, but what's really needed is for our governments to push all of the corporations that are using these resources to do more. But anyway, we'll come back to this discussion. Did I drag him back a little bit? We'll come back to where Michael asked him a question. And I think that's going to be here. Here we go. So we'll start this section again and we'll let it go. Now, after this, Michael speaks with his colleague, Ash, and they have a very good discussion. So we'll go through that as well. And then I'll have a bit more to say.
How these climate financing sort of mechanisms work. Is there a central fund, and then if you're a developing country, you can say, we want to build a wind farm, can we have some support? Or we need to build some, flood defenses, can we have some support? How does this work?
It's a bit complicated because there are a series of funds. So there's not one fund. There's a Green Climate Fund, there's an Adaptation Fund, and there's a Loss and Damage Fund. And there are various other mechanisms. Most of them are empty. And so developing countries, come with projects and they say, this is our need. We've done this need assessment, and they apply to these funds. And these funds are meant to then say, yes, here's the money to be able to do that. But if these COP funds are empty, where do developing countries go to? So what developing countries are told is, well, go to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund.
So there's the rub, and this is why a lot of this is a con, and why we need to look at our own governments and understand the game. They don't actually put the money into the funds. There isn't enough money to put in the funds to cover all the works that need to be done. So they put some into the funds, that gets drained for projects. There are projects happening, but it's not enough. And when a country comes and says, we need to do, as this gentleman has just said, we need to do some groundworks, perhaps for to mitigate the damage for potential flooding, or flooding that we know is going to happen at some stage. They go to one of the three funds that the United Nations and the COP process manage. There's no money in it. So then they get told, go to the IMF, go to the World Bank. So then they borrow money at less than commercial rates, but making a profit for the banks that are based in the developed world that are doing all the damage. So it's no wonder that some countries did not want to agree to this, because now this is the framework that is locked in, that now every developed world government will say to any other government that needs some aid, oh no, there's a process in place, go through that process. And that process props up the skewed world financial system that is already in operation. So it's very disheartening when you see this is the outcome of COP. But anyway, let's keep going.
And get some more debt creating loans, like Pakistan was told to do after it faced one flood which caused $45 billion worth of damage. They had to beg for more debt creating loans. The other thing that developed countries say is, well, why don't you look to the carbon markets? Now, the carbon markets has been set up by developed countries, which many of us call is basically a permit to pollute, which says developed countries, rather than cutting their own emissions, would be able to buy a permit by supporting some emission reduction somewhere else in the world. I mean, firstly, there's not enough carbon budget to do that. Secondly, most of these carbon permits, are not worth the paper they're written on. They result in no emission reduction. And thirdly, most of the money actually goes back to global north banks and private corporations, very little to frontline communities, which is why developing countries have always insisted what they want is this money to go into these funds, which are governed under the United Nations. Therefore, they can be transparent, there could be more effective governance over them, and they have a far better chance of actually directing the money to where it's needed.
Let's talk about the COP process, because one thing I have to say, reading about this today, that somewhat confused me, is my understanding was for an agreement to be made at a COP, it has to be unanimous by consensus. But then we've also seen the Indian representative sort of come out and say, let it be known, we don't support this. So how can it be that this agreement has passed with, well, at least one country here saying they don't support it? How does that work?
Not only did India oppose it, Cuba, Bolivia, the least developed countries, many countries were indignant about the way that this process took place. So this process, like every other process, is governed really by geopolitics. Rich developed countries wanted that outcome. They got the presidency to announce it and gavel it through without any opportunity for any country to raise any objection. So once it's gavelled through, you can raise your objection and it's just noted, but the decision's been made. And that's why many people felt that this decision was bulldozed through against the wishes of developing countries, because ultimately rich developed countries said, we cannot not have this deal. We want this outcome here in Baku. And they got what they wanted.
Sorry, just to go into a bit more detail there, because this is still somewhat confusing to me. So to gavel something through, that's to sort of, hammer that hammer, isn't it? And say the deal is done, sort of like, as you see, sort of a judge does. But so would the presidency, the COP presidency, sort of say, we've got this deal, any objections, hammer, and then they sort of use the gavel before anyone's had a chance to raise an objection? Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, he didn't even say, are there any objections? He said the deal is done, didn't look up and just gabbled. And India very clearly said, I let you presidency know, and I let you the secretariat know that we wanted to speak before there was any outcome, before it was finalized. We wanted to raise our objection, but you ignored us. This is a complete farce of a process. Now, it's happened before, but usually it's happened to countries which are small, like Bolivia, when they objected about the Cancun agreement after Copenhagen. And other countries just, well, it's only one small country, who cares? But this was ignoring a major developing country, India, and the ramifications of that may not necessarily end in Baku. I think the Indians were spitting blood about how they'd been treated. And again, you may have heard the Indian negotiator speaking in Baku, and she was saying they were totally being disrespected and this deal was illegitimate and that they didn't agree with it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that does sound like a very odd process where you can just say a deal has been done, use the gavel and then any objections come up. Sounds very odd to me. Presumably it's because there have been enough backroom deals between enough powerful countries that they think it can stand. But as you say, India is...
Just stop Michael there for a minute. And then it's no wonder that the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, has grown to encompass more countries. So it's quite likely that the stance and the attitude and the mechanisms used to get this, well, I'm not going to call it an agreement because it does look like it's not an agreement, to get that put through so that the developed world, the global north, as Asad Rahman is referring to it as, something to talk about, so that ministers in in Europe and in Australia and in the UK and Canada can be saying, "Oh, look, we've got this global agreement. We're all on track." It's totally insufficient, and now you've got a very significant country in very upset at the way they were treated. But let's pop back into this and see. We'll get a bit more information out of what the COP29 agreement really means.
And this deal was illegitimate and that they didn't agree with it.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that does sound like a very odd process where you can just say a deal has been done, use the gavel and then any objections come up. Sounds very odd to me. Presumably it's because there have been enough backroom deals between enough powerful countries that they think it can stand. But as you say, India is not a small country. I mean, in fact, it's the most populous country in the world. Let's end by just talking about Trump. Obviously, Trump didn't have a representative there in the sense that he's not yet president. He will be president come January. We assume he will take the United States out of the Paris Agreement. How significant will that be, and to what extent was sort of the Trump presidency hanging over COP in Baku?
So Donald Trump has said he will withdraw the United States from the Paris Agreement, and his ally, President Milei of Argentina, after 3 days of the negotiation, ordered the Argentinian delegation to return home. He's another climate denier. So we know that the United States, under Trump and Milei and other leaders like that, want to completely crash the climate negotiations. And of course, that hung over everybody's head. The United States and other developed countries were saying, look, if we don't get an agreement here, it's going to be much worse when Donald Trump comes in power. Then there'll be no conversation at all. And in reality, all what's been happening over the last decade of the United States dragging its feet, weakening the climate agreements, trying to shift responsibility for its own actions onto other countries, for ensuring that it's now the largest fossil fuel producer in the world. This is not under Donald Trump. This was under President Biden. This was under President Obama. The United States is the largest oil producer. It is expanding its oil and gas, very much like the United Kingdom is, like the European Union, Australia and Canada. So what you see is, yes, there is this existential problem of Donald Trump, but there's a much bigger problem, which is that the rich developed countries don't want to break their addiction to fossil fuels either, because it's generating huge amounts of profits for their companies and corporations. And so they're coming in, not with that same level of ambition, and pointing the finger at developing countries and saying, why don't you cut your emissions?
That was Asad Raymond speaking to me earlier today about events in Baku. And closer to home today, we have our own climate-related news.
The water flooded in faster than they could bail it out. Residents in the valley town of Pontypridd rallied together as emergency services responded to the devastation of Storm Bert. Many angry at what they feel was a lack of preparation.
Put a flood defence in instead of a Harry Potter fence. Do your job, what we pay them money for.
As you can see, National Resources Wales have just replaced the railings back again. He doesn't do anything. As soon as he goes, he comes in through there again.
Nice.
8 o'clock this morning I was told to move my car. And I moved my car safely. But 8 o'clock this morning, but it was already coming in.
The council here declared a major incident on Sunday. Extra resource was deployed and rest centres set up nearby. A lot of people have only just repaired their homes after the last big flood in 2020. Now they're back to square one, but it's not just houses that have been ruined. Businesses have been destroyed here as well.
So this is not an unfamiliar kind of scene in certainly in Australia, and not last week, a week before, in Europe, where people were given, authorities were given the likelihood that flooding would occur, and of course the calculation was, it probably won't happen. We'll deal with it when it does happen. But all of the data that people have collected over the last 20 or 30 years about flood risk and storm surges and flash flooding is all based on data that is now no longer applicable. They need to magnify the risk significantly because the rainfall events are greater and more frequent than had been the case when those statistical records were collated and then analysed for the models. So people need to start being a bit more honest about what the future entails. But I do feel for these people in Wales. We'll just catch the end of this because I think certainly people in Australia will be familiar with the kinds of scenes that are here. But this is now becoming a regular thing in the UK. Obviously, we're seeing more of it in Europe, or it's certainly turning up more often on the news. And these are costs that individuals have to bear, communities have to bear over and over and over again. So to ignore it just seems foolish. But then again, in terms of, as that last commenter on the Novara Media video did say, within the lifetime of a child born now, we're going to be over 3% anyway on country trajectory, which will basically make human life an absolute misery. So, yeah. Anyway, let's keep going. I want to get to the next discussion in a moment, where I think somebody with a background that is not strictly Anglo-Saxon has a good point of view. But anyway, let's go.
For garage owner Gareth, his whole business has been lost overnight.
Our drum's obviously gone over and the oil's spilt everywhere.
Everything's coated in oil. Many of his customers' cars, now write-offs.
But I'm gutted. Obviously, it's how long is it going to take to sort it out? And I'm going to lose money either way, and I have the time to take all it. I can't work on people's cars when I'm trying to sort all this out. It's devastating.
That was Sky News reporting on Storm Bert. Now, of course, all forms of extreme weather are more likely because of climate change, right? We will be seeing more of this in the coming years, and it will.
Would we ever see a report like that on the Australian version of Sky News, with a bit of a hint towards climate change? I'm guessing no, but that was an interesting aside. Oh, and by the way, those of you watching live, I'm getting a little delay on that. It looks like the video I'm playing is delayed. Can you let me know if that's what is happening, or is it okay? Those of you on YouTube, anyway, just give us an idea. Pop it in the comments.
Will be happening more often. However, sometimes it can seem like bringing that up when people are in the middle of a personal crisis, as so many people in that video were, can seem a bit awkward. It can seem like political point scoring. But that doesn't mean it's not necessary. You still have to do it, right? And George Monbiot made the point well on LBC today.
Storms are intensifying as a result of global heating, partly because sea surface temperatures are rising. That leads to much more extreme storms than we had before. We're seeing higher winds, we're seeing bigger dumps of rain. And we have not done what needs to be done to reduce global heating, but B, neither have we prepared ourselves for the impacts of that heating. So we've really failed on both counts. And for people like me, it's intensely frustrating because I'm 39 years now into being an environmental journalist and campaigner, and I've basically been saying the same thing throughout. And it feels like bashing your head against a brick wall. What does it take? As you so rightly ask, what does it take for people to wake up?
As we talked sort of earlier in the show, how Elon Musk, or a mobilized right,
I just want to stop there for a minute. George Monbiot, if you are at all interested in climate information, I suggest that you follow him on X, if you're still there, or find him on Blue Sky. Reliable, science-based, fairly reasonable, I think, with the way he communicates. So, yeah, I've been following him for years, and I share, I haven't put anywhere near the time and effort into convincing people that we need to do something different. We need to make changes. 39 years he's been an environment journalist and saying the same thing. So it must be very disheartening. A bit like we talked about a little while ago. How do you stay committed and engaged when you are not seeing much change, positive change? Anyway, that's for another video. I wanted to get to this discussion between Michael Walker and Ash Sarkar, both Novara Media hosts and contributors, and I think there's a really good perspective that you'll hear. So let's go for that.
As you so rightly ask, what does it take for people to wake up?
As we talked sort of earlier in the show, how Elon Musk or a mobilized right could change British politics. I suppose I'm really interested, and I think it's difficult at this point to tell how sort of repeated climate events are going to change politics and public opinion. Because, there's one theory that sort of the more this happens, the more climate change causes people, obviously this flood isn't that extreme. You would have seen this before climate change, but you will see this kind of thing more often because of climate change. That's just a fact, right? Warmer temperatures means that more water is absorbed in clouds, and that means that you'll get heavier rain and you'll get more floods. Now that's, a flood like this could have happened before climate change, but it will happen more often. And there's one theory that sort of the more this happens in the rich world, the more there will be sort of an increasing demand for climate action, and that's going to really transform the politics of all of this. I'm not as sure. I mean, Ash, what do you think about this? Do you think extreme weather will really wake people up to climate change being a massive issue?
I think that's dependent on other things. So one of the things to bear in mind is that people's experiences of floods or extreme heat of the kind that we saw just a few years ago when you saw fires, and I think it was either Kent or Essex, I think it was, where people's houses burnt down. That all happens far less frequently than the activities that we all participate in, which drive global heating. And I think that matters. I think that the way in which we're locked into these activities, whether it's driving or flying, I mean, I don't drive, I do fly, or various acts of consumerism, so sort of non-essential buying of goods, again, something I do. We all do these things much more frequently than we experience extreme weather events. And that matters because I think that's part of the sense of being locked into a system which is difficult to change. And also that's the area that the right can really, really thrive in by saying to people, well, they want you to go on holiday less. They want you to have fewer nice things. They want to make your bills, your cost of living overall more expensive. So I think that's a real difficulty there. And I also think there's something else which is really difficult, which is, not just in terms of us as in, voters, citizens, but, successive governments, the extent to which they've been locked into a kind of policy making which benefits fossil fuel producers and retailers. So one example of this is energy prices. The amount that we all pay for our electricity, that price is set not just in terms of how much it costs to pay for renewable forms of energy production, solar and wind, which are the cheapest forms of energy production around. That electricity price factors in the cost of coal, oil, gas. Why is it that...
Let's stop there for a minute, because you know that in Australia we have a a system where any energy price rises, now that we've got a national market, have to be authorised by a bureaucrat in that responsible for that energy market, right? Or as part of that energy market body. Now, there's a specific position that similar to with health insurance, where they go, oh yes, you can have a 4% rise in tariffs this year. Wouldn't it be innovative if they just said, well, actually, the cost of renewable energy is cheaper than you want to sell your energy now? I tell you what, you can't have an increase because you should be providing the lowest cost power that you can. That would certainly get those power companies to move quickly, wouldn't it? But we're going to have to get over the NIMBYism that we have with we don't want wind farms in our area, and we don't want solar farms in our area, and anyway, that's a whole different challenge. But let's hear Ash out.
People are skeptical. Some people are skeptical of a green transition. Well, it's because we also haven't felt the benefits of the green transition that we've had already. So stuff like that really matters, I think, for when it comes to people trusting.
And that's the point I was making, and Ash said it so much better than I ever could. That if the energy price regulator said, hey, there's actually a cheaper way to deliver power, to deliver energy, and you should be doing that. So no, you can't have a price rise. Consumers win, and it puts the pressure back on the companies to continue to move in that direction. We've got a comment through here. Murray, maybe tell us about this. Climate change is alive and well. My solar in Sydney in November is down over 500 kilowatts this year. Now, what do you mean is down? Are you telling me? Are you saying that you are getting less sunlight because of the amount of clouds and storms that you've been getting in Sydney? Is that what you mean by 500 kilowatts down? Because there's certainly other parts of the country where I'm sure their sunlight budget is up. Anyway, I'll wait for you to fill me in, and also let me know, is the video, when I'm playing it back, is it coming through at the right speed? Because when I'm looking at my monitor and it's looking like it's lagging and delayed. But anyway, let Ash finish off, and then maybe we can continue our discussion. I'll bring her back. Just come back a minute or so.
How much it costs to pay for renewable forms of energy production, solar and wind, which are the cheapest forms of energy production around. That electricity price factors in the cost of coal, oil, gas. Why is it that people are skeptical? Some people are skeptical of a green transition. Well, it's because we also haven't felt the benefits of the green transition that we've had already. So stuff like that really matters, I think, for when it comes to people trusting that the next thing is going to be better, and you're not just going to lose the sort of comforts of consumerism that you have right now. I also think that there is a level of one of the things I've been thinking of a lot recently with regards to the Trump victory, obviously, has been weaknesses in the left's case, things that we don't want to acknowledge, things that we don't want to look at ourselves with regards to. So one is our choice of targets. And I do this all the time. I think about, okay, what are the things that we need people to clamp down on? It's things like SUVs. That's easy for me to say because I don't drive. I don't really like talking about things like foreign holidays because that's something I quite like. I think that there are charges of hypocrisy, which are thrown at either climate campaigners or left-wing people who are talking about things like a Green New Deal, and we're vulnerable to those accusations because they're true. The easiest way to avoid charges of hypocrisy is never try for anything better in the first place. But I think that's an area that we're vulnerable in, which is we sort of set up these targets which are sketched out on the basis of the kind of life that we don't live, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, I suppose. I suppose the pushback against climate action is especially. I think we probably will see sort of people talking about heat pumps adding costs, etc. I hope that we can do climate action without having to make many personal sacrifices, because I think otherwise the politics is going to be very difficult. And like you, Ash, I also want to go on foreign holidays. So I'm hoping these things can be made consistent, but obviously there is somewhat of a tension. I also can't drive, so I get to feel nice and self-righteous because of that.
Okay, well, that was what I wanted to present to you. I think that was a report that encompasses much more than I have been seeing in any of the other media I've been consuming about COP29. So I hope you found something useful and something you didn't know before in that. The fact that it will be portrayed as a unanimous decision of countries where we know that India, Cuba, Bolivia were the three countries named, did not agree. But we also know that many of the Pacific Island nations were very unhappy with it, and they probably haven't spoken out because they're really at the mercy of countries like Australia continuing to support them. So I don't know. Now, Murray, I saw you popped up that you're getting less sunlight, more cloudy days. I got to say, when I used to tour with bands, every time I went to Sydney, it bloody rained. So I think this idea that Sydney is sunnier than Melbourne, I think is a myth. I think it's just the distribution. Now, we're obviously in some places where some places are going to have their weather altered as their climate shifts. And if Sydney does become sort of more subtropical rather than a temperate climate, you may well get more cloudy days and more storms, which I guess means you're going to need more solar panels, or you're going to need wind. I don't know what, but certainly the change is here. I agree with you on that. Certainly, the thing I've personally noticed in Melbourne, in Wurundjeri country, is that it's more humid more often. It's humid on days that are not particularly warm, and at times of year where you wouldn't expect humidity to be occurring. So, yeah, don't know what more to say about that. So I'm apologising for not running my COP29 stream yesterday, but I hadn't seen anything that was going to give me enough information to speak coherently about it, and I hadn't really formed my opinion. I was very sceptical when I get headlines come through on my newsfeed that there's been an agreement reached and there's no detail, and the United Nations COP29 site had not updated, and I thought maybe they're struggling with how to promote it. I think if India feel like they have been ignored and poorly treated in the way this outcome has been arrived at and then reported, I wouldn't be surprised if that leads to long-term difficulties for many countries in their trade relationships. Bearing in mind that India is going to be a powerhouse in the not too distant future. I might just say I saw an interesting stat come up on X, Twitter. Oh, excuse me, just a little while ago. That of all the countries in the world, the United States has a positive balance when we talk about immigration from all countries in the world. That is, there's more people leaving other countries to go to the US except for one country. And you know what that country is? Absolutely. It's Australia. So, Australia, there are more Americans coming to Australia than Australians going to America. So get ready for that southern twang or that Boston drawl coming to a cafe near you. Murray has said COP29 fossil fuels won again. Well, I have no fossil fuels in our house, and need more panels, and you might need to think about getting a couple of those little turbines. I'd love to be able to have one of those little, one or two of those little turbines here. We're quite windy where I live, so I reckon a couple of little roof-mounted systems would derive quite a bit of power. But I'm not the owner or the landlord here, so I just have to do what I can. We're going to have to confront the issues of what we eat. We're going to have to eat less meat. We're going to have to change our agricultural economies. Not only because of climate change, but also water usage. There's going to be less water in most places. Many agricultural catchments are going to really experience significant water deficits. And then those competitions over water for agricultural production and water for people's basic needs will come up over and over and over again. And what's frustrating for me is that we know these things and we are not having conversations about them because they are difficult conversations, and there will be winners and losers, and people will need to adapt what they do, both in a personal sense and industries and individuals running businesses, be they agricultural businesses or manufacturing businesses, or even people doing sales. The amount of stuff that people do driving around. I remember when I was a sales rep many years ago, driving around all day every day sort of seems a bit crazy when you can pop onto Zoom or something like this. You can do a FaceTime chat to your potential customer, and because all we were ever doing was popping in and going, "How are you going?" That was what most of the work was, and then taking a similar order that you would have before, or offering them a special, and all of this doesn't need to be done face to face. It may be less effective right now, but over time, I don't think that's going to be the case. So there's a myriad of things that we can change, and that we need to start talking about changing. So that's about it. Has anybody got anything else I would like to contribute? Thanks, Murray, for your first-hand situation as someone who is now off-grid. Now with your home setup, Murray, do you still have to pay for the fact that the power lines go past your house? Let's see. My first 12 panels were fitted in 2012, still working with low efficiency. Would like to replace them 80 watts to over 400 watts. Now that's again one of the issues that we need to speak about too when it comes to the talk about the changeover. Your solar panels become less efficient over time, which means to create the same amount of power, you need to add more panels. And then we have the issue about recycling them and is it worth keeping older panels in your array and adding new ones to them? I'm not an engineer. I don't know what those answers are, but I'm guessing that newer panels are more efficient. But we're still going to deal with a recycling issue and a waste issue, and we need to be having those conversations. Yeah, so any other questions, comments? What are people considering doing? I mean, no, that was the question I had for you, Murray. Yeah, being off grid, having a solar. Are you selling back to the grid, or are you completely off grid? Because the one thing I remember years ago, I did the sums and I worked out where I was. There was no way I could totally disconnect from being involved in the electricity distribution system. You still had to pay for the fact that they went past you. So wouldn't mind knowing those answers. But otherwise, that's about all I've got today. I thought that Novara Media do follow them. I'll link when I upload this to YouTube and it's out there. I'll put in the description the correct link to Novara on Blue Sky, and let's just have a look what their Novara Media on YouTube. I watch a lot of Novara. I find I think because they're in the UK, they have a perspective which sort of matches pretty closely to our experience in Australia, rather than just hearing the American side. So yeah. Now Murray has told me. He says Murray pays 1.399 cents per day, but get a rebate 60 cents per day credit. Have home battery and have not paid a power bill since 2023. So you do get charged, but you are selling back to them. Is that that's the understanding? You've got an excess and you're selling back. I did see that some power companies are refusing to buy excess power. So that would be interesting. We might do a whole conversation, Murray. If you're willing, we might try and do a whole home solar and solar hot water and heat pumps, and talk a lot about what the options might be for all sorts of households, without someone trying to convince you to buy something. So I think a lot of people are skeptical of a lot of the figures that are bandied about. So there we are. Let me have a look at the board. 30th of November is the next time that I have something lined up, but I'm hoping that's Saturday night, 8 p.m. My mistake for anyone who was waiting to speak to Biz Bell. She actually did reschedule, and I thought she'd rescheduled to Saturday night just gone, but I didn't check closely enough because we've changed it so many times. I just thought, oh, she's changed it from from Tuesday to whatever it was. But no, I was a week early, so I was sitting here waiting last Saturday, but no, it didn't happen. Saturday the 30th, 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. We will be talking about securing species on isolated offshore islands, but Biz is currently doing rat eradication in Northern Ireland, so we'll be able to speak about that. What have we got? Murray says only 0.4 cents for exports. Got it all. Heat pump, hot water, good. Lawn care is all battery. I hope you mean you don't have a lawn. That's one of the big things that we in cities like Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane, where we are going to have water deficits over time. We need to be collecting all of our stormwater and using as much of it as we can, not just for horticulture, golf courses and watering ovals and everything, but we need to be treating it for domestic use as well, because at the moment we're relying on desalination, and desalination is going to be hellishly expensive. And currently, to run the desalination plants, that electricity is coming from fossil fuel power plants. So we need to be looking at all of this and having the conversations, and not having arguments, but having conversations, because these are 20, 30, 40 year, 50 year changes, and we need to start bedding them in and planning for them. So yeah. All right, folks. Well, if I do get somebody who is locking in a conversation before the weekend, I'll be popping up in your feeds. But otherwise, do watch your notifications, because I'm going to schedule Dawn Chorus. Now, Murray's saying he's on virtual power plant with his battery. Now, I'm assuming that's a power management system. I'm going to assume that manages what comes in and what goes out and how it gets used. I'm guessing that with your battery too, you are moderating your power consumption at various times through the household, and that you probably run your washing machine at particular times. And anyway, we'll have to have an in-depth conversation about this, and maybe get some other people with different technologies that they are proposing and promoting, and get them in to talk about that. But there we go, folks. That's the bird emergency done for today. I know we're not talking birds, but the birds rely on the climate as well. That's why I'm interested in it, not just because of us, but if we mess up the climate, we're going to destroy biodiversity even more. So, I say, yes, aircon is too powerful and eats battery power. Well, that's something I know. Look, we had aircon installed in this place. I think we're into our third summer with aircon. I don't think it's a second. It might only be a second. But we try not to use it, because when we use it, it spikes your power bill. So we close up the house early, keep it dark. We've got blinds outside. We pull them down, and we pull the inside blinds down, and try and keep the house cool, so that if you do put it on, you only put it on for maybe half an hour or an hour to bring the temperature down, and keep it down. But first world issues, as Murray says. That's right. I'm amazed it wasn't hot here yesterday. It was hot here the day before. And yesterday, even though it was only 24 degrees or something, my neighbours' aircons were running flat chat, which I just don't understand. I just do not understand it. But yeah, Murray, you are dead right. First world problems. But I think we need to be going back to fans. Well, I think most people, Murray's saying it's 38. Yeah, I know that. I was wondering if anyone from New South Wales would actually be wanting to be sitting down inside in a seat watching a stream today, because I do know that it's going to be extremely hot, and I think you're going to be very hot tomorrow, where we had our couple of hot days and now we're back to really nice, mild conditions. And actually where I am in the western half of Melbourne, we're not getting the rain that the eastern suburbs and the northeast of the state are expected to get. So I'm assuming that I'll be seeing some flash flooding on the news tonight and tomorrow night, along with all the other bullshit that passes as news nowadays. But, all right, I've said goodbye 3 times. This time I mean it. I look forward to catching up with you, if not Saturday night, talking about securing endangered species, particularly seabirds on offshore islands, and also pest eradication in Northern Ireland, the rat eradication. Just to let you know, Biz Bell, or Elizabeth Bell, she's the Managing Director of Wildlife Management International. She's been working in this field of pest eradication, habitat re-establishment, monitoring endangered species on remote islands, sub-Antarctic, off the coast of New Zealand, on projects all around the world. And she's got 30 years experience. She's got quite a large team now as part of Wildlife Management International. So we'll talk about her work, her career, some of the projects, a bit about her team. So that should be great. We've rescheduled it so many times. It's definitely going to happen this week, I'm sure. And otherwise, if some of the other people I've invited on are available later in the week, I'll be back on your screens. But I don't think I've really got much I want to talk about. But we are going to schedule the Dawn Chorus for, not for this week, maybe for next week. And we're going to get back into doing some member shows. And, Murray, have you seen the special Desolation Dodo T-shirt that I have, or that design that I have? It's on T-shirts and mugs and keep cups at the moment, but I haven't put the site up. Have you seen the design? I'll wait for someone to tell me if they have or they haven't. If you haven't, I'll run the video again just for a minute that will show you the design. Well, while we're waiting, I'll run it anyway. It's this one, I think. Murray says, have not, has not. Okay, well let's run this. You'll see this straight away. There you go. That's it. Let's have another look. There it is. So it's a dodo walking through a wasteland of a forest that's been cut down. So there's going to be a couple of offerings: the original Bird Emergency logo, the Desolation Dodo, So yeah, and you may not be aware about the habitat gardening selection of plants that I'm throwing into an annual membership. So I might come on and talk about those. We might talk about those before Saturday. Habitat gardening. Oh, sorry, that's the next time we're back on. Habitat gardening, 9:30 a.m. Saturday morning, Australian Eastern Daylight Time. I've actually got. I'm interviewing a nurseryman who is really into the idea of habitat gardening, promoting native plants. But he's from New York State, so we're going to get a North American, New York State view about habitat gardening. He runs a nursery similar to the way I used to, so I'll be very interested in his perspective. And he popped up in my Blue Sky feed, so Blue Sky doing a good job of getting the people that I might be interested in front of me. If you are on Blue Sky and you're not following me, just look for The Bird Emergency. That's where I'm at. And it won't be terribly long before I completely, pull the pin on the X account. It's driving me mad. I want to do less social media and not more, and I'm enjoying the engagement that I'm getting on Blue Sky. So I encourage you to give it a try. You might find that it's to your liking. I find it much better than Threads, even though there's more people on Threads. I just don't. I see more stuff that I'm not interested in, and there's less engagement I'm finding on Threads. So anyway, first world problems. What social media do you like? What could be more of a first world problem than that? I'm Grant. This is the Bird Emergency. Look forward to seeing you on Saturday morning, Australian Eastern Daylight Time, 9:30 a.m. for Habitat Gardening, or 8 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, Saturday the 30th for BizBell, talking about securing, monitoring, protecting endangered species on offshore islands. I'm Grant. I'm a bird nerd, also a plant nerd. Thanks for being with me. Good to see you again, Murray. Been a little while. Good to see you. Cheers.